I feel like vampires are one of the few things that gaming has really yet to oversaturate, and after a pretty long hiatus of memorable titles around the subject, we finally got another one to add to the list here with Arcane Studios' Redfall.
You serious?
A 4-player open-world co-op FPS that's just been released for Microsoft Windows and the new Xbox consoles, with PS5 players sadly missing out.
Can't let that stand.
When I was coming up for titles for this video, I kept trying to think of some kind of lame vampire pun that I could use. You know, something about the fangs not being sharp enough or nailing a coffin shut. But the simplest approach is often the best, and I think the most accurate way to describe Redfall is with one word: underwhelming.
There's nothing you can do to stop us.
Yeah, look, Redfall ain't exactly the worst game ever made, but it's sure as hell an unimpressive one. And for something that's been delayed, you've gotta wonder if this is the state that it's even supposed to be released in. Taking a page out of Stephen King's Salem's Lot, the whole thing's set in a fictional coastside American town that's under siege by vampires, even using that iconic 80s font made popular by so many John Carpenter films and recent TV series like Stranger Things.
I clapped when I saw it!
The intro shows how Redfall used to be a thriving, idyllic town before an evil pharmaceutical corporation tried to create a biological weapon and use infected blood. Yeah, sounds familiar. This ended up turning members of the population into more or less vampires, and then they did what vampires do and go around sucking blood, popping collars, and wearing uncomfortable looking leather outfits.
We think we're dealing with a supernatural being, most likely a mummy.
Things eventually took a turn for the worse, and when a bunch of outsiders tried to intervene, the vampires pulled the water up off the ocean floor like a giant aquatic barrier and prevented anyone from getting in or out. And you're choosing to play as one of the 4 people who actually managed to get in.
I think they can save this place.
You've got a telekinetic girl named Layla, combat engineer Remy, a sniper named Jacob, and a cryptozoologist named Dev, not to be confused with a crypto bro.
Chasing after the unknown is my life.
And you're heading into the town to take down the so-called 4 vampire gods that are holding the place hostage, beginning with one called the Hollow Man, not to be confused with a Kevin Bacon film of the same name. And from a gameplay perspective, these are at least some interesting characters to play with, all with vastly different abilities. Remy, for instance, has got a little robot that can attack and distract enemies, along with throwing out a remote C4 charge and creating a rally point to heal her allies. Dev throws out a little javelin, which does electrical damage over time. He can also drop down a UV light rig, which heals allies and staggers nearby enemies, and also throw out a translocator like it's Unreal Tournament back in 1999, bypassing roads and pathways and taking the direct route to get to hard-to-reach spots.
Skipping ahead.
Layla can summon a telekinetic lift, which launches players into the air. She can block incoming damage with an umbrella, and even call in her vampiric ex-boyfriend for help. No, really. And then Jacob the sniper can send out a raven to scan the area, he can cloak to stay undetected, and summon in a ghostly rifle that deals heavy damage, which kind of feels like the lamest Call of Duty perk ever. But despite every character otherwise still pretty much using the exact same weapons, these abilities do make each of them feel unique. I mean, those navigational skills like Dev's translocator and Layla's elevator are actually pretty useful, because the town's got a lot of verticality with its many cliff sides, hills and tall buildings, so an ability that lets you skip over these is more than a gimmick and actually becomes a handy feature. Unlike the recent Dead Island 2 though, where every character's got access to the same powers after a couple of hours of in-game time. Much like Dead Island 2 though, this is a game that really kind of excels in co-op, making a somewhat boring and run-of-the-mill game just that little bit more entertaining. Which kind of makes it all the weirder how they only included campaign progression for the host. And that's to say that if you play through this with a couple of mates, only the person who's actually hosting has their story progress saved. Otherwise you keep your guns and you play a level, but none of the actual campaign progression is carried over. Plus it has no drop-in or drop-out options, so everyone has to ready up from the beginning, which is an awful idea, because if someone disconnects or crashes, then you have to reload the entire match. Yeah, and I mean, it's not like these kind of 4-player co-op games are ever known for having drop-in, drop-out, are they? Still though, if all you wanted was a basic, easy to pick up and play co-op shooter that's available on Game Pass to play through with the boys, well, then there are definitely worse things out there. You'll spend a whole lot of your time here killing things, fast traveling around the map, mostly back to the safe house where you pick up main and side missions, along with salvaging all that unwanted gear for scrap and stocking up on important items. I mean, yes, it's a run-of-the-mill, but it's functional and it works as intended. And I'd probably be fine with the whole thing if it wasn't coming from the likes of Arcane Studios, who are charging more than full price for this and who really should have done a bit better. Yeah, over here in Kangaroo Land, they're asking for $120 for this thing, $120 dues, and that's for the most basic edition.
Question is, how is it achieved?
Now, first things first, let's talk about how this thing looks and runs, and sadly this is yet another in a long line of PC ports that seems to be poorly optimized at launch, keeping things in line I guess with both Deathloop and Dishonored 2 before it. Now, I don't know if Denuvo is again to blame, because I know Arcane are fond of putting that in their games at the cost of heavily impacted performance and pissing off almost everyone who knows about it. Either way though, Redfall is sadly another game that seems to run really crappy.
Let's get moving!
I've got an RTX 4080, an i7-10700K, and 64GB of RAM, and the frame rate frequently drops to around the 30 or the 40 mark, when I'm at 1440p or just regardless of what settings I've got. I know that they said too that it's going to run at 30 FPS on the console, so maybe in some weird way they're trying to at least keep it consistent with the PC performance as well. Either way though, it doesn't seem to run very well, and for a rig like mine to have these kind of issues is a big problem. I've even got a mate who couldn't get the game running at all. It just kept crashing after a few minutes of playtime. It almost seems like it's a memory leak issue, with performance being okay when you first start playing, but then after like an hour or so of game time, the frame rate would drop down to the 30s or so, and I'd have to restart the entire game to fix it. Settings like DLSS often fixes this kind of stuff for me, at least with most other games anyway. Here though, when I turned it on, I didn't really see any change at all, and it made other aspects of the visuals look even worse.
The fuck is that?
So yeah, first Jedi Survivor and now this. Not really a good week for PC gamers, is it?
I'm so glad I stayed.
But I think the even bigger problem is that it just doesn't really look that good anyway to justify running so poorly. Now I know Arcane games have never been about pushing super realistic graphics, but all of the previous games they've worked on have always had like a definitive look to them, mostly in the way that the environments were put together, but also just the way that characters looked and the overall style and aesthetic. I mean, artistically they were gorgeous. Even when they helped out working on Wolfenstein Youngblood, you could absolutely see the influence coming through. Redfall, however, doesn't really have any of that, and even the playable characters are just kind of generic visually. And why does it seem like almost every single playable character in video games these days looks like that could be a Fortnite skin? There is some creativity to the vampire designs, with their elongated body parts and their spindly fingers, but it just doesn't feel like you're playing an Arcane game at times, and those out-of-place weapon models with these tacked-on optic sights and basic reload animations, it's the absolute definition of soulless. Hacking into things or lockpicking doesn't even have any kind of intuitive minigame or any real inputs, apart from just having those easily obtainable lockpick or hacking kits in your inventory and just holding down the interact button. And then the cinematics are flat and static, you know, they're more or less just like 3D slideshows, with narration over the top of them instead of actual proper cutscenes. And look, to be fair, this might have been done as like a stylistic choice, but it just kind of feels lazy in comparison to the interactive nature of the cutscenes in their previous games.
Personally, I don't understand the appeal.
More than that though are the countless amounts of bugs and glitches that I experienced, both visual and otherwise. From things like the lighting not really loading in properly, the leaves on trees looking like it was having a seizure, bizarre physics and animations, through to areas where it feels like you can feel the assets loading in real time. The user interface is also kind of annoying at times, because after every completed mission this prompt comes up to say that you finished it, and to remove this you have to hold down the escape button until it goes away, and that's something that's just kind of frustrating if you're still in the middle of combat. Half the time I found myself just double checking my settings to make sure I was still playing on the ultra mode, because some of these areas just look so barren and flat, I thought my game might have suddenly reverted back to the lowest setting or something. And I just don't get it. Like, I just don't understand how, despite how far gaming engines have come over the years, that so many recent games seem to both look and run worse than they did decades ago. I mean, damn dog, if even DLSS can't save us from horrible performance and frame rates, well, then nothing can. Where I think the visuals truly shine is during the numerous vampire nests you move through. Now these are these bizarre pocket dimensions that remind me a bit of the Upside Down in Stranger Things, and these show off really unnatural architecture and have a genuinely unsettling vibe. Like you're travelling through this unstable plane of existence, which you are. All that's missing is a super fun happy slide.
Super fun happy side!
Most of the heavy narrative stuff is handled here, as you learn all of the backstories for these vampire gods and how they lost their humanity, some of which is actually interesting and disturbing. Plus they also serve as handy ways to get new weapons, with the player having to destroy these realms while looting as much gear as you can before the whole thing collapses. So it's not only unique from a gameplay point of view, but also something unique visually. The concept of Redfall being held captive by the ocean, with the water being like held in time, surrounding the entire town, also looks awesome, and it is a cool concept, really making you feel like you're trapped in this literal hellhole. So you get these brief glimpses into how spooky and artistic the game could have actually been, with sequences making good use of creative lighting and eerie sound to really highlight that horror atmosphere. But most of the time, the environments just look like a PS4 game.
Can't you do...
And those oh so scary vampires are just standing out in the middle of the open, often during the daytime too, which is about as scary as seeing a puppy dog wearing devil horns. That is to say, it's not very scary. I feel like 90% of the houses and buildings are just completely inaccessible, you know what I mean? They're boarded up and locked off. I've even seen doors that don't even have doorknobs, like someone just forgot to put one in entirely. You'll see the same couple of buildings copied and pasted across both maps you explore, and even the same interiors as well, which even starts to become confusing, making it seem like you've been somewhere before, when in reality it's just the same environment being reused again. I've got a bit of a theory too that they actually plan to have vehicles in the game as well, because throughout the map you'll come across quad bikes and buggies, which look like they could easily fit a couple of people on them. The maps are pretty big as well and feature lots of roads and pathways, so drivable vehicles would have made sense, right? But instead, now they're all just props and more or less the same as exploding red barrels. Fuck! Either way though, it all harks back to what I said before, how the whole thing feels so underwhelming, and I fully realised how half-baked the whole thing was when I found out you can't even slide down the fire pole at the firehouse. And look, I mean, it's not really that much of a big deal, but how can you have a game set in a firehouse where you're going to be frequently going from the top to the bottom floor, include a fire pole, and not let the player slide down it? It's sickening. Making me sick!
Wow! This place is great!
Now, when it comes to the shooting and the combat side of things, Redfall plays like a pretty standard first-person shooter. That being, you either run or sprint around, you aim down sights and shoot at enemies with assault rifles, pistols, and shotguns. You come across chests, which contain bigger and better weapons, with the kind of rarity states you'd find in any other RPG, and items you loot can be converted into credits for buying medkits and other items. There's also stealth in the sense that you can avoid detection, kind of, and whack people in the ass for an easy and quick kill, but it's definitely not very developed and not intended to be the focus. Or overall, the whole shooting loop I think is fine, aside from just feeling a bit sluggish. Combat is then either broken up between fighting human enemies, usually different factions of cultists, some with automatic weapons, and then a few different kinds of vampires, none of which though put up any kind of fight. Human enemies can mostly be dealt with by a single well-placed headshot, and their reaction times are so laughable that I can only assume that the intelligence requirements for becoming a cultist these days are about on par with the kind of people who make reaction videos to movie trailers.
Here we go.
It is kind of neat seeing these guys infighting at times, but I mean, that's about the height of their creativity. In fact, I think it even might be the worst AI in an Arcane Studios game yet, which is doubly disappointing considering how smart the enemies used to be in the Dishonored games. You really don't have to play the game for too long here to see this as well. I mean, they'll do things like not even react when someone gets killed a couple of meters away from them. And even the most basic task of being able to shoot and hit the player, like it seems impossible to them at times. I actually noticed a lot of similar enemy behavior when I was playing Deathloop, and I remember that some people tried to justify that by saying that it was because the enemies had masks on, and were all cooked off their chops on drugs and alcohol, which may or may not have been true. Either way though, I'd love to see what weird justifications people can come up with for why these enemies are also so brain dead. And for one of the main and most common enemy types to be almost completely unthreatening, that's a pretty big fuck up.
Definitely not a normal day of maintenance.
The other side of the combat coin are the vampires, and early on it's like the game tries to make it seem like this might be a bit more challenging. You fight one of these very early on in the basement of the firehouse, which is actually kind of creepy at first, especially the way they set the whole thing up, showing the shadow of it as it feeds on some poor unfortunate asshole. And the mechanic of only being able to kill these guys by driving a stake through their heart, it seems like a neat idea.
Take that, vile fiend!
But you very soon start to realise that they're really just another run-of-the-mill enemy. But aside from having a bit more health points and being more mobile, there's really nothing challenging about them at all. When a vampire's health gets knocked down to 0, they become stunned, at which point if you've got a weapon with a stake on it, which are a dime a dozen by the way, you can shove that thing in their heart and finish them off. But there's a bunch of other ways to finish them off as well. For instance, if they're hit by any kind of elemental damage in that stun state, be it fire or electricity, that kills them instantly. Flare guns are a common weapon type, and against a single vampire, you can just easily whittle down their health and turn them into dust after a few well-placed shots. Very early on in the game as well, you'll no doubt come across the stake launcher and the UV ray gun, both of which are also laughably overpowered. Now the stake gun does what it sounds like, firing out a single stake, more or less like a railgun, which does insane damage.
Steak?
Money's too tight for steak.
Steak?
And can often take out most vampires in a couple of hits, if not just one hit.
Sure, steak.
The UV gun, on the other hand, petrifies vampires after sustained fire, locking them in place, at which point you can shoot or simply punch them, and they'll shatter into a million pieces like the T-1000 after walking through liquid nitrogen. It becomes so easy to do this, and these weapons are scattered around in such abundance that it is a bit of a wonder how the vampires are any threat at all, when a few seconds of exposure to these guns and a simple left hook is enough to completely destroy them. The stake gun has been balanced out somewhat by having a very slow reload time and a slow fire rate, but that UV gun, it doesn't suffer from any of that. And the fact you get both of these weapon types very early on in the game removes any kind of threat or challenge from fighting the vampires to begin with. I mean, they could have gatekept these weapons until the late game and made them like hard to acquire or something. I mean, it'd be like playing Doom and getting the BFG in the first level. There are tougher vampire variants though, which have some really fucking annoying attack patterns, but still, like, the same tactics more or less apply to finishing these ones off as well.
New kind of vampire.
If you piss off the vampire gods enough, they even send down a super tough one called the Rook, not to be confused with the Rainbow Six operator of the same name. And this is a guy who walks around with a hooded robe over his head like a total edgelord and sounds like Dr. Claw from Inspector Gadget. The concept here is the more noise and attention you attract, the higher this meter fills up until they then send in one of these guys to make you feel humble. And yeah, I mean, these fights are admittedly a little bit tougher, but they're still usually easily manageable. And the fact that these are randomly occurring, happening at whatever point you've filled up that arbitrary meter, also means they can spawn in at really weird times and show off some janky behavior. To actually take on the vampire god in each area, you first need to uncover their whole backstory, but then collect the skulls of underboss vampires, which are kind of like the sub-bosses in each neighborhood. And you'd think that maybe even these ones would be a little bit tougher, right? Nah man, they're just the same as the other ones, and they often go down just as easily.
Is that it?
Throughout the map are a bunch of safe houses, and after unlocking a safe house, you do a side mission, which then makes it possible to do another side mission to take out that neighborhood's underboss, right? At which point, when they're killed, you can collect their skull and be 1/3 closer to accessing the area's vampire god. Does that make sense?
Got the gist.
And the only issue is that you have to collect these skulls to progress, more or less forcing you to do the side missions. And it's just that same loop repeated over and over with not really that much changed. Oh yeah, and by the by, this is all on the highest difficulty mode. Well, at least the highest difficulty mode you have access to for the first playthrough. And I feel like you really have to have a complete mental lapse to ever be properly killed here. Now, I played solo for maybe, I don't know, 70% of my game time here, and I did die a few times to certain boss fights, but that's only when I got kind of distracted, and nowhere near as often as you'd think I would considering the mode I was playing on. I just felt like outside of the boss fights, there was never like a sense of the difficulty really ramping up. You just get inundated with items and weapons from the get-go. In fact, I got my first legendary after about half an hour of playtime, and it just never really evolved from that. I actually would have really appreciated if some of these vampire types were more or less unbeatable unless you'd reach a certain level or unlocked a certain weapon type. You ever play that game Terminator Resistance? Well, it was a really fun game set during the Future Wars, and for the first couple of hours of the campaign, you had to outright avoid the T-800s because you just didn't have the weapons to take them out head on. You had to find and unlock the plasma energy weapons, which could actually damage these things, but before that, you more or less had to run away or just avoid them entirely. And I can't help but wish that they kind of did something similar with Redfall. Now, maybe that could make it so you had to find the technology to first make the UV guns in the first place, or craft your very own stake launcher after finding the right components. But instead, they took the most casual approach and made every single feature and weapon obtainable from the beginning. So it just feels like there's no real room for progression. You even get access to all of your abilities after a few missions. But ironically, they don't include better versions of medkits, so the medkits you've got to use when you've got 100 maximum health points are the same when your health has reached like 400, requiring mass spamming just to get your health back up. It's all kind of sad in a way, the way that the approach to game development seems to have devolved these days, and developers have to be so quick to catch the player's attention that they'll just give you every single toy and trick so early on. Even Dead Island 2, which, yeah, I just did a video on, by the way, did the exact same thing, having you play as this zombie-killing juggernaut from the get-go. Remember when you used to play games and it took you like hours to finally get to that power fantasy level? I mean, damn dog, I still remember playing Final Fantasy VII back in the day, and first unlocking Cloudstrife's final limit break. Yeah, well, nowadays they just give you everything you need after a couple of hours of playtime. Redfall will ultimately get the same usual assortments of 7s and 8s out of 10 from most publications. It'll probably also still get a pretty decent player base for the next few weeks anyway. And like I said at the beginning, if you're looking for something to play with your mates and don't really care about the whole nitty gritty of the whole thing, well, then there's not really any reason to not play this.
Clip.
I said it before, it's not the worst game ever made. And if they fix all the performance issues on PC, well, I'm sure it'll be fun to play through, mostly. Fans of Arcane Studios and those of us who know what these guys are truly capable of, though, are definitely going to be disappointed, and justifiably so, because it's yet again another step backwards for these guys, at least in the gameplay sense anyway. And it's just kind of hard to digest the fact that the guys who made Dishonored, and probably the best System Shock spiritual sequel we're ever going to get, have been reduced to making something like this. You know what, at least it doesn't have zombies. Fucking hate zombies.